For as long as I could remember, the lake had been mine. Not in the way city people think of ownership, with deeds and lawyers and papers sealed in courthouses, but in the way of a man who had cut his hands bloody raising a cabin from raw pine, stacking rock after rock to form a dam that tamed a trickle into a reservoir, and watching the waters slowly swell year after year until they reflected the sky like polished glass. I had built my life around it. The mornings were for coffee on the porch, listening to loons cry as mist rose in slow curls from the water. Afternoons were for fishing or chopping wood, depending on the season. Nights were for sitting by the fire and letting silence do the talking. The world beyond the tree-line could have collapsed into ash, and I wouldn't have known. That was the point. Peace wasn't something you could buy. You had to build it, with your back, your sweat, and your patience. It had taken me nearly 2 decades to make the place what it was. The dam, for one thing, wasn't just a wall of stone. It was a promise I made to myself when I first stood knee-deep in the stream with a shovel in my hand, that no matter what storms life brought, I'd carve out a space that was mine and mine alone. I scavenged timbers from an abandoned sawmill and hauled them upriver by mule. I shaped the spillways by hand, hauling gravel and clay to seal them. When I finally closed the gates for the first time, I remember standing there, chest heaving, covered in mud, and watching the water pool up against it. I thought, this is what freedom looks like. When the reservoir filled in and spread wide enough to reflect the ridges, I named it in my mind, though I never told another soul, Lake Adeline, after my grandmother who used to say water never belonged to anyone except God. She'd laugh if she knew I ignored her words and made the place my own anyway. But still, she was right about one thing: water remembers. It remembers who respects it, and who abuses it. That first decade, I rarely saw another human face besides the occasional hunter or hiker who'd wander too far from the county trail. They'd wave politely from a distance, maybe ask if they could fill a canteen, and then vanish back into the woods. I liked it that way. I wasn't a hermit, just a man who valued the sound of cicadas over the roar of engines. The lake stayed clean, the fish grew fat, the deer came to drink without fear. Sometimes, if I sat still enough on the dock, a heron would land right beside me, as if I were just another log washed ashore. That was my measure of success. Not money, not neighbors, not accolades, but whether the wild things accepted me as part of their rhythm. And for a long time they did. Of course, peace like that doesn't stay secret forever. The world has a way of sniffing out what's still pure and trying to bottle it, sell it, slap rules and regulations on it. The first hint came quiet. Survey markers hammered into trees along the far ridge, orange tape fluttering like wounds in the breeze. I ripped them down at first, figuring some college kids were mapping out a forestry project. But then the county sent letters, thick packets filled with words like zoning adjustments and development opportunities. They weren't addressed to me personally. My land was private, and I'd paid the taxes every year, but the letters spoke of unused surrounding parcels and tourism potential. That phrase alone made my stomach turn. Tourism. I'd worked 20 years to keep this place hidden, and some bureaucrat behind a desk wanted to paint it on postcards. I crumpled the letters and fed them to the fire, but the unease lingered. It was the feeling you get before a thunderstorm, the air too still, the birds too quiet, the pressure sinking in your chest. By the time I saw the first convoy of trucks on the dirt road, I knew the storm was real. They came like ants, engines grinding, loaded with prefab lumber and bright plastic signs that announced a future vacation community, as if paradise could be measured in square footage and rental fees. I stood on the ridge that day, hands curled into fists, and I felt something inside me tighten. The lake below still shimmered in the sun, innocent and unaware of what was coming. The herons still hunted in the shallows, the fish still leapt for flies. But I knew my quiet life was about to collide with something bigger, uglier, greedier than I'd ever faced. And though I didn't yet understand how far they would go, or how far I would be forced to go to stop them, deep down, I felt the shift. The lake wasn't just my refuge anymore. It was about to become a battlefield. They didn't knock on my door. They didn't ask permission. The homeowners association simply arrived, as if summoned by the county's whisper and the smell of easy profit. One week it was survey crews hammering stakes into the mud, the next it was bulldozers growling like beasts through the tree-line. They carved wide scars into the earth where once only deer trails had been. The men wore bright vests and mirrored sunglasses, and they looked at me like I was a trespasser on my own land. When I walked down to ask what in God's name they were doing, one of them smirked and said, "Future Residence Access Road, buddy. Gonna be a whole lot busier out here soon." I told him he was on private property. He shrugged, jabbed his thumb at a clipboard, and said the county had leased shoreline access rights to a newly formed association. An HOA. The word was sour in my ears, like poison. I had heard of them in suburbs and gated neighborhoods, boards of petty tyrants who measured grass blades and fined old ladies for the color of their shutters. But out here, in my woods, on my lake, it seemed absurd. At first, I thought it would be temporary, some slick developer scheme that would collapse once they realized how far they were from Starbucks and Wi-Fi. But then the cabins started rising. Fast. They were prefabs, trucked in by the dozen, dropped like Lego blocks onto scraped foundations. I counted them one by one from the ridge. 20, 50, 100. The trucks kept coming until there were 139 little boxes crowding the shoreline I had once walked in silence. They weren't homes. They were vacation rentals, churned out cheap for weekend tourists who wanted the illusion of wilderness without lifting a finger to earn it. They even had the audacity to build docks jutting out into my lake, like fingers prying open a wound. I went down to one of the construction supervisors, waving the old survey maps that proved the lake sat squarely on my property. He laughed in my face. "Lake's a public resource now," he said, like he was declaring scripture. "HOA's got the lease. You're welcome to join if you want. Membership dues are $200 a month." The insult burned hotter than any campfire. They were charging me, the man who built the dam that made the lake exist in the first place, for permission to stand on my own shore. I refused, of course, but they treated my refusal like a joke. They posted signs, "Private access, residents only." They hired security, young men with mirrored glasses who patrolled the dirt road in golf carts, as if they were guarding some suburban cul-de-sac. When I tried to fish for my dock, one of them pulled up and told me residents had priority, and suggested I use the community pier instead. My blood boiled so hot I thought I might swing the oar in my hand at his skull. But I swallowed it. Not yet, I told myself. Not yet. The true cruelty of an HOA isn't in the structures they build, it's in the rules they invent. Within weeks, they had drafted a 30-page handbook filled with prohibitions. No campfires except in designated pits. No dogs off-leash. No excessive noise after 9 p.m. No hunting or trapping on association property. They even banned swimming outside the roped-off area near their so-called community beach. I read through the list one night by lantern light, and each line felt like a nail driven into the coffin of the life I'd carved here. They weren't just trying to manage their cabins, they were trying to erase me, to scrub me from the lake like a stain on their glossy brochure. Still, what cut deepest wasn't the rules or the cabins or even the security guards. It was the sound of the lake changing. Where once I heard loons, now I heard children shrieking on jet skis. Where once the only engines were the occasional outboard, now there was a constant drone of generators and air conditioners. The water, once clear enough to see trout darting beneath the surface, grew clouded with oil slicks and sunscreen. Beer cans floated in the reeds. Fireworks exploded across the ridges every weekend, sending the herons flying in panic. It wasn't just that my sanctuary had been stolen. It was that they were killing it, inch by inch, under the banner of community improvement. And as I lay awake one night, staring at the ceiling of my cabin while bass thumped from some rented deck down the shore, I realized something I'd never wanted to admit before. They weren't going to leave. They weren't going to stop. And if I wanted my lake back, if I wanted my peace back, I'd have to do something I'd sworn never to do. I'd have to fight. It wasn't the fences that broke me, though they were insult enough. Ugly metal grids hammered into the earth, stretching across the dirt paths I had walked 1,000 times in solitude. They slapped padlocks on the trailheads, posted laminated signs that read residents only beyond this point, and acted like the very soil I had bled into was theirs by divine decree. No, the fences weren't the worst part. What gutted me was the sight of my Lake Adeline, reduced to a backdrop for their petty kingdom. Every weekend, the cabins filled with strangers hauling coolers, blasting music, hollering across the water. Their kids tore through the woods on ATVs, leaving ruts in moss that had taken centuries to grow. Their dogs barked and fought and chased off the deer that once drank freely at the shallows. They called it vacation, but what I saw was invasion, an infestation of noise and greed that drowned out the very heartbeat of the land. I sat on my porch, watching jet skis carve scars across the water, and for the first time in my life here, I felt like a prisoner in the place I had built with my own hands. The HOA didn't stop at rules. They came with teeth. One afternoon, I returned from hauling wood and found a notice nailed to the post of my dock, a violation. Unauthorized structure. Not in compliance with community standards. My dock, hand-built years before their precious association ever existed, was deemed illegal. A week later, another notice arrived, threatening fines if I didn't dismantle it. I crumpled the paper and threw it in the fire, but they weren't bluffing. They started sending men, clipboard carriers with smug grins, taking photos of my cabin, measuring my shed, scribbling notes. One even had the gall to tell me my woodpile was unsightly and would need to be brought into compliance. I laughed in his face until he threatened to call county enforcement. That laughter turned to bile in my throat. I wanted to scream that this wasn't their land, that the lake existed because I'd dammed it, that I'd kept this place alive while they were still sipping lattes in their subdivisions. But they weren't listening. They never listened. To them, I was already an outsider in my own home. It grew worse when they took the water itself. They posted lifeguards at their community beach, young men in red shorts who barked orders at anyone daring to swim outside the roped-off area. They declared fishing restricted, without a permit purchased from their HOA office. One evening, I took my canoe out just as the sun was setting, the water glowing like liquid fire. I'd barely cast a line before a pontoon boat with a spotlight pulled alongside. A woman with a clipboard shouted over the hum of her generator, accusing me of poaching. "Residents have priority access after 6, she said, as if reading from a script. When I told her I wasn't leaving, she wrote my name down, God knows where she got it, and promised I'd be hearing from the board. That night, as I dragged the canoe back onto my dock, I felt a chill colder than the wind on the water. They didn't just want to push me aside. They wanted to erase me completely, to paint over the man who had lived here longer than any of them had even known this place existed. And what was left for me? I tried to retreat into the woods, into the silence I had once trusted, but even there their reach spread. They had mapped and fenced, chopped and paved. The animals fled deeper each day. I rarely heard the loons anymore. The herons had abandoned the shallows. The deer no longer bedded near the dam. Even the trout seemed fewer, driven from the reeds by boat traffic and chemicals seeping from sunscreen, gasoline, and beer cans. My sanctuary had become a theme park, and the wild things that had once accepted me as kin were scattered like refugees. I walked the shoreline one morning and felt like a ghost haunting my own past. Everywhere I looked, there were traces of what I had lost. The fire pit where I once roasted venison, now bulldozed. The hidden cove where I used to swim alone, now littered with plastic bottles. The ridge where I used to sit and watch the sun spill across the glassy water, now scarred by a row of cabins squatting like ticks. The grief was almost physical, a weight pressing down on my chest until every breath felt like a labor. It was then, standing at the dam I had built with my bare hands, that I understood the cruel truth. The lake was no longer mine. Not legally, not spiritually, not in the way that mattered. They had stolen it, piece by piece, rule by rule, laugh by laugh, until all that remained of my freedom was a bitter memory. I placed my hand against the cold stone of the dam wall, feeling the steady vibration of the water pressing against it. 20 years of my life had gone into shaping this reservoir, and now the very thing that gave them power was the same thing I had created. It was bitter irony, like sharpening a knife only for your enemy to use it against you. But as I stood there, staring into the dark water spilling over the gates, a thought slid into my mind as smooth and dangerous as a snake in the grass. If the lake no longer belonged to me, maybe it shouldn't belong to them either. Maybe it was time to let nature reclaim what was hers. I'd always treated the dam like a living thing, a beast I'd coaxed into slumber with stone and timber. I knew its moods, the creaks in its ribs when the spring melt swelled the lake, the way the spillways sang after a heavy storm. It was strong because I had built it to be strong, but it was also mine because I understood it. Every rock, every log, every steel bolt was a memory of sweat and labor. That night, though, as I stood on the wall with a lantern in hand, I no longer saw it as a monument to my work. I saw it as a weapon, quiet, patient, waiting for me to loose its jaw. The cabins across the water glowed with artificial light, their windows throwing ugly squares into the night. Laughter echoed, brittle and shrill, carrying across the lake like mockery. The HOA had stolen my land, my peace, my life. But they had built their little empire on the very thing I controlled. They thought they could take the lake from me. They forgot I could take the lake from them. The gates themselves weren't complicated. I designed them to be practical, not fancy. Steel cranks bolted to a crossbeam, connected by chains to the sluice doors. Turn the wheel, lift the gate, and the water rushed free. It was meant as a safety measure, a way to relieve pressure during floods, but tonight it was something else entirely. I set my lantern down, grabbed the cold metal of the crank, and felt its familiar bite against my palms. For a long moment, I just stood there, listening to the silence of the forest, the steady push of the lake against the dam. Was this justice? Was it vengeance? Or was it simply inevitability, the land taking back what was hers through my hands? I thought of my grandmother's words, "Water doesn't belong to anyone." Maybe she'd been right all along. Maybe I was just returning the world to balance. The first turn was slow, stubborn, like the dam itself was testing my resolve. The chains groaned, the metal screeched, and then the gate shuddered as water licked through the cracks. The sound was soft at first, like a sigh. Then, as I cranked harder, the trickle grew into a roar. The lake surged toward freedom, pressing against the opening with decades of weight. I kept turning, muscles burning, until the sluice door lifted halfway. The water shot out in a furious torrent, white spray exploding against the rocks below. The roar drowned out everything, the frogs, the crickets, even the faint thump of music from the cabins. It was the sound of release, of wrath unchained. I moved to the second crank, heart hammering, and spun it open faster this time. The dam vibrated under my boots as another jet of water tore through the darkness. Downriver, the channel swelled, a hungry serpent writhing toward the valley. At first, nothing changed on the lake's surface. The cabins still shimmered in the lantern light, still pulsed with laughter and music. But then the shoreline began to creep backward, inch by inch. The docks sagged as the water slipped away from their posts. Boats grounded themselves in mud that had not seen daylight in 20 years. I stood on the dam, watching as the waterline receded, and I felt a savage satisfaction rise in me. Let them see what it means to build their castles on stolen land. Let them see what happens when they spit in the face of the man who held the keys. The laughter across the water faltered, replaced by confused shouts. Flashlights darted through the cabins as people ran outside, staring at their vacation paradise unraveling before their eyes. Some screamed about burst pipes, others about their boats. None of them understood. Not yet. The drawdown turned into chaos by dawn. The once proud lake was nothing but a muddy basin, its heart ripped open and rushing downriver. The cabins, built cheap and close to the waterline, leaned awkwardly on their foundations, some already cracking under the sudden shift of soil. Their precious community beach turned into a swamp of reeds and muck. Fish flopped helplessly in shallow pools, gulls circling overhead to snatch them. The HOA board, those smug tyrants in pastel sweaters and clipboards, marched out in a panic, barking orders at each other, demanding someone call the county, call the state, call the EPA. But no one could command the water. No one could order nature back into chains once she had been set loose. And standing above it all, lantern still burning dim beside me, I felt no regret. For the first time in months, the silence was mine again, not the silence of peace, but the silence of reckoning. When the sun rose the next morning, the lake was gone. What had once been a mirror of sky and forest was now a sprawling mound of cracked mud and stranded stumps. The cabins that had hugged the shoreline looked pathetic in the daylight, their cheap stilts sunk in muck, porches tilted, steps dangling over emptiness. Their proud little docks lay crooked on dry ground, nothing but skeletal fingers pointing into air. The homeowners staggered about in disbelief, their vacation dreams turned into nightmares overnight. Some shouted, others cried, some simply sat on their porches staring at what used to be lakefront property. The HOA board assembled in a frenzy, clipboards flapping, cell phones pressed to ears, arguing over liability. But there was no salvaging this. Their empire had been built on borrowed water, and the water had walked away. The county officials came soon after, their trucks grinding down the ruined access road. They swarmed the place with cameras and measuring sticks, muttering about damages, permits, violations. A sheriff came to my cabin with 2 deputies in tow, asking questions, trying to read my face. I told him the truth. The dam was mine, the land was mine, the lake had been mine to control since the day I raised those walls. I hadn't broken any law. The sluice gates had been built for flood control, and I had exercised my right to open them. The water had simply gone where it was meant to go, downriver. What happened to the cabins wasn't my concern. The sheriff chewed that over, frowned, then admitted there wasn't much they could pin on me. If anything, the county was to blame for allowing an HOA to slap their claws on property they never owned. The officials weren't interested in justice, though. They were interested in covering their own hides, pointing fingers anywhere but at themselves. The HOA tried to fight, of course. They filed complaints, drafted letters, held emergency meetings in their sagging community hall. They threatened lawsuits and demanded restitution, but without the lake, their leverage crumbled. Tourists canceled bookings. Residents packed their SUVs and drove back to the suburbs, muttering about misrepresentation and fraud. Within a month, more than half the cabins stood empty, for sale signs rotting in the mud. The so-called association dissolved into bickering factions, each member blaming the others for not foreseeing disaster. Some accused the county, some accused the contractors, and a few brave ones accused me outright. I didn't argue. I didn't defend. I just sat on my porch, listening to the quiet creep back in, and let them howl. Their noise, for once, wasn't strong enough to reach across the silence. Nature, as she always does, began to heal. The mud dried into cracked clay at first, but rains returned and spread new streams across the basin. Grass sprouted in the shallows, reeds grew tall, and within months, frogs returned to the puddles that remained. Herons came back, stalking the new marshland. Deer ventured down to chew on the fresh shoots. I walked the old shoreline one evening and found turtle tracks where jet skis had once screamed. It wasn't the lake I had built, not yet, but it was something purer, rawer. A reminder that the land had existed long before me, and would continue long after. The cabins stood as scars, wooden skeletons rotting slowly, but the earth would reclaim them in time. Vines would climb their walls, storms would tear their roofs, and one day no one would remember they had ever stood there at all. As for me, I stayed. I tended the dam, kept the gates open just enough to let the basin breathe, let the streams run where they wanted. I rebuilt my dock, not for boats this time, but as a platform to sit and watch the sun go down. I no longer thought of the lake as mine. It belonged to no one, not really, but I was its caretaker, as I had always been. The HOA had come with rules, with arrogance, with greed. And in the end, they left with nothing but mud under their boots and dreams turned to rot. I didn't celebrate, and I didn't mourn. I simply sat in the silence they had once tried to take from me and let it wash through my bones. Justice wasn't loud. It wasn't in the courts or the counties or the clipboards. Justice was the sound of crickets returning at dusk, the sight of loons circling overhead once more, the deep breath of a man who had fought and endured and, in the end, had given the land back to itself.